How does any nation decide or act according to their national interest? Who are they counseled by? Is there any official department of the national interest? And who are the people analyzing and anticipating all of that? Okay, so what you're saying is that every nation does have a certain national interest depending on the nation. I mean, the Pakistani national interest would be different from the Indian national interest, which would be different from the Chinese national interest, which would be different from the national interest of Ghana or Botswana or Peru, and so on. Every country, depending on its geography, on its history, on its culture, ethnicity, and so on and so forth, would have a different uh, set of national interests, core interests, peripheral interests, and so on and so forth. So, who decides what is the national interest? It's typically the government that is in power and the politician or politicians who are at the who have the decision making authority at the highest level. They are the ones who would decide what is the national interest. And it's look at India's own history. Did our so called leaders in the 20th century truly pursue India's national interest? Did we? Did Mr. Nehru pursue India's national interest? Did he promote and further India's national interest? He embarked upon this path of Fabian socialism. He stifled the Indian economy. It grew at 1% or 2% per year, the Nehruvian rate of growth. He imposed this enormous web of bureaucratic red tape on India. Is that following India's national interest? No. So very often you will have leaders who are kind of, well, what polite word do would you like me to use about the great Shri Nehruji? Well, let's say clueless, incompetent. I think that's the nicest thing you can say about him. And similarly, there are lots of other countries whose leaders don't pursue, don't promote, don't further the national interest. There are these despotic little tin pot dictators in Africa who are the fruit of the century or so of colonization of Africa. Africa has been divided up into artificial nations which don't recognize ancient tribal and ethnic divisions. So you have civil wars, you have these dictators that are propped up by European and Western powers. And these dictators don't care about the national interest. These are artificially created nations. So they don't care about the national interest, they care about enriching themselves. So it's very easy to influence such people. Look at the Chinese debt trap diplomacy across the world. They go into these poor countries which are run by these dodgy characters. They use checkbook diplomacy. They give them whatever money they want, and then they have them sign off on these ridiculous loan terms. So there are lots of countries whose leaders do not follow the national interest. They do not act according to the national interest. So they enrich themselves and their own family, and they ruin the nation in the process. See what happened to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was entrapped by the Chinese. It's now the Indians who are having to bail Sri Lanka out. So there is no official department of the national interest in any country that I know of. It's about the kind of system that you have. Is your system good enough? Is your system so good that it gives you leader after leader who knows what the national interest is and who will act according to the national interest? Does your system throw up competent leaders? Does your system throw up excellent leaders? Or is your system hit and miss? Sometimes you will have a good leader, sometimes you will have a terrible leader who will undo decades of good. So it depends on that, right? So that's how it goes. I mean, if you look at thousands of years of history, you will find that you have empires that rise and fall. Empires that rise and fall. If you look at India's history in the past 2000 years, you 2,500 years, you had the Mauryan Empire. It rose, it made India great, then it crumbled. Then you had Pushyamitra Shunga in his empire, which was rather short lived. Then you had the Kushan Empire, which reached its zenith during the time of the great Emperor Kanishka. And then the Kushan Empire also crumbled. Then you had the Gupta Empire, then you had the empire of the Karkotas, then you had the Chola Empire, then you had the invasions, and then you had the Maratha Empire. The Maratha Empire could have been so great. It freed India from foreign occupation, and then they fell because of uh, because of the wrong kind of leaders that came up, weak leaders, and so on. So that's how it goes. So it's always a cyclical thing. So eventually, in any such cycle, you will have leaders who do not act according to the national interest, or who are not strong enough that they can do it, who do not know how to control the levers of power, and then things go astray.